musical theater mash.
I got Tonys on the brain. Tonys are driving me insane. You like it? Watch out, Pasek Paul and Dave Malloy, I'm coming for your Tony Award. What a week! I can barely contain my excitement. I hope you can barely contain your excitement too. Tony Awards are so soon! It's been a week full of videos and fun and grand discussion, and I wanted to top it all off by talking about what you had to say. So I've gone through a bunch of the comments from all over the place and pulled out some questions and some interesting thoughts, and we're gonna talk about them. Get ready. Disgruntled Cashier writes about Groundhog Day. What I want to know is that if Andrew Call, Carl's understudy, went on opening night instead of him, would Call have been nominated for Best Actor? So the answer to this is maybe. You have to go into the Tony Awards Rules and Regulations document. It is a wonderfully fabulous, dry document, but filled with some really interesting tidbits. Like this one, rule number 2K Roman numeral 1, in order to be eligible, an actor or actress must perform in the role on the production's opening night and must perform in the minimum number of performances to which the producer of such production must invite and make tickets available to Tony voters as required in Rule 6 or 4, I don't know, Roman numerals. Basically, Call would have to perform not only on opening night, but also on every night that Tony voters were invited. So really the under-over is if Call had gone on for Carl on opening night, chances are neither of them would have been eligible. Jessica Boren asks about Come From Away, have you ever heard of forensics theater? That is exactly what this is. It brings me back to my high school days. Forensics theater, that is the phrase I was looking for when I was making that video. That whole kind of speech and debate style of, competitive forensics acting, that is exactly what Come From Away is, and done so well. Samuel asks if I was really on the cast recording of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. I was, so were 100 other people. I'll put a link down below, or maybe I'll find some pictures to put up, but they had this wonderful event that I got to be a part of where they recorded some of the big chorus numbers with an audience of several hundred people. The Goodbye My Gypsy Lovers part and some other parts of Balaga and some egg shaking. It's really cool. And, I'm sure it's very, very far back in the mix on the recording, but it's probably there. It's really cool. It was a neat experience. Mack Blank, on the topic of Dear Evan Hansen, asks if I've seen the Slate article, the hero of the likely Best Musical Tony winner is a lying creep everybody loves. I have not read this article, but I think I found it. The title is Dear Evan Hansen, You Are a Creep by Jason Zinnemann, and it's on Slate. I read the article. It gives me a lot of mixed feelings, but it certainly captures a sentiment that I'm seeing bubbling up on the internet. The gist of it is this. The author argues that Evan Hansen is not a character to be lauded or lifted up because he takes advantage of this tragedy by lying to everyone and doesn't get his rightful comeuppance. The whole internet, as far as the show is concerned, still thinks this story is entirely real. Now, I really do think the thing this article is exploring is kind of the crux of what makes Evan Hansen popular. Like, I mentioned it. This show doesn't succeed if you don't find some kind of sympathy with Evan Hansen, and the grappling you have with that as an audience member, I think that's one of the delights of this show. I do also think this article somewhat conflates Ben Platt's popularity with Evan Hansen's popularity, and, the applause for the actor is not necessarily applause for the character. That's how theater exists, but that's also kind of beside the point. Really, the big problem Zinnemann seems to have with this show is that Evan doesn't get his rightful comeuppance. He's not properly called out for this awful thing he does. I have some problems with that kind of statement. If you listen to the song Good For You, you certainly don't think that, Evan is winning in this event, in this discussion. Like, he feels awful about it. And that is, yes, before he admits the thing, but I think that's also the point. It's that, lying doesn't pay off, and, you're gonna get trapped in it anyway. Also, I would question what then should be the rightful comeuppance that Evan should feel. A kind of public shaming? I've got real issues with that. As someone who exists on the internet, no one should be publicly shamed on the internet. Yeah, that's a whole can of worms and really complex anyway. But really, I don't think millennials, teenagers are leaving this show going like, aha, Evan Hansen was able to get away with deceiving all these people. What tragedy will I deceive people with? Like, that's not, people don't leave it with that. The connection people find is, you know, the social anxiety that Evan feels and his way of dealing with our social media influenced world where we are performing 100% of the time into the empty void of the internet. I mean, this is a show about how a lie in 2017 is a lie that you have to live every second of your life, because we are always, you know, a text or a message or a snap or an Instagram or a YouTube video away from a million other people. And like, that is the thing I think people relate to. But anyway, it's an interesting article, worth reading if that's a perspective you haven't seen on this musical. Where were we? Caesar writes, he wants to ask how I would compare the original falsetto recording, or recordings, to the revival cast recording. I love all of them, but somehow for me it feels so much different and I can't really put my finger on why. I agree. I noticed this a lot with especially this kind of time difference in original recording and revivals. Nowadays, things that came out in the late 70s, early 80s seem to sound really, really different from their revivals that premiere now. And I actually attribute a lot of that even to just maybe the recording studio process and like how the actual production of the recording is created, because, you know, in the 70s and 80s you're recording to a different format, either a cassette tape or an 8-track or a record, and nowadays we're recording for Spotify, and, you know, it's like the whole world is different. But also I do think this revival capitalizes on a different brand of acting choices and singing choices that the original didn't so much. And I attribute those to very time-specific trends in musical theater. This Falsettos is very much influenced by the contemporary musical theater sound that surrounds it on Broadway, if that makes sense. Maybe. Anna writes she's pretty sure that they're releasing Falsettos in theaters and she cannot wait. And Kent says hashtag PBS Big Bird Tapes. The video dropped today. They are releasing Falsettos in theater. Ask the world for what you want and it will grant it to you. Thank you. On the topic of falsettos, Lauren wants the world to know that Anthony Rosenthal was robbed, and the world agrees with her. And Anthony himself says sideways heart. Fist bump my YouTube broski, break a leg on the telecast. Kyle writes a lot of things about Hello Dolly, but the thing that stood out to me, in his show that he saw of Hello Dolly, Bette Midler flubbed some lines and she vocally told the audience that she did so, rewound the scene, and started over. And from what he's been able to find on the internet, this seems like a semi-frequent occurrence, and the question is, does that have something to do with the drama of Bette not performing on the Tonys? This is what's been going on in the back of my mind, and no shade thrown at Bette Midler. Like, being on a Broadway stage is something entirely different, even for seasoned performers, and so it's okay to feel nervous about something like that. I wish, you know, I wish there was a way for us all to say like, hey, it's gonna be okay, like, we got you. I do think the people who watch the Tonys, the people who love musical theater and love Broadway, are also a really forgiving and sympathetic audience. And so whatever happens with the Tonys, I hope at least that message can make it to Bette Midler. Also on the topic of Dolly, Robert says, I don't believe there's ever been a production of Hello Dolly that truly honors the character offered in the script. I agree, Robert. I love Hello Dolly, but I think there is some depth to the character of Dolly Gallagher-Levi that is not fully explored. I mean, this is, in its deepest form, a story about a woman recovering from the death of her husband. I mean, she's a widow who removed herself from a wonderful society she used to live in and is coping with re-entering that, also by bringing love back into the world. Like, this is a part of the story that doesn't get brought up in a lot of productions, and it's totally there. You have to look at how the characters use Dolly Gallagher-Levi's name throughout the thing. For the most part, Vandergelder calls her Dolly Levi, using her married name, the name given to her now deceased husband. But at the very end, as he's starting to actually admit that he's fallen in love with her, he calls her Dolly Gallagher, using her maiden name. And there is a suggestion of this release and moving on into the world. It is what gives that emotional impact to the Act 1 closer before the parade passes by. Yeah, One of these days we'll get a gritty reboot of Hello Dolly. Maybe. Wyatt says, I will now be thoroughly disappointed if Kevin Spacey doesn't tap dance dressed as Alexander Hamilton. Me too, Wyatt, me too. Kira, or Kyra, sorry if I'm getting that wrong, my bet is that Dear Evan Hansen wins over Great Comet. Evan Hansen is La La Land and Great Comet is Moonlight. I think that is one of the most apt descriptors ever. No shade against Evan Hansen, La La Land on the other hand, but there is a, more of a pop culture Wonder Bread kind of feel to Dear Evan Hansen that Great Comet is more of an acquired taste. And the Tony voters seem to flip the other way than Academy Award voters, and I think that is the metaphor I wish I had in my mind. Sarah says, please make a video about Miss Saigon, smiley face. Carly says, don't meh, Miss Saigon, it's my favorite musical, face. And Zach says, the Miss Saigon 25th anniversary broadcast is worth a watch, especially if you haven't seen the show, but I wonder if it wouldn't have been nominated were it not for Sunday taking itself out of consideration. I've gotten a lot of comments about my comments about Miss Saigon. I don't like Miss Saigon, and you're allowed to like it even though I don't like it. I think some of the things it says, doing it nowadays about race relations and this kind of like white savior approach are really problematic and makes it not quite the right show to reboot nowadays. And I hear the argument about casting Asian actors on Broadway, and my counter argument to that is write shows for Asian actors on Broadway. Don't just fall into these same sorts of traps where you're gonna have to cast most of them as prostitutes. I talked about it for hours on a podcast, which I'm sure you can find. Anyway, Miss Saigon, not my favorite, sorry. Michael Stokes says, note to self, Tommy likes Miss Saigon. Listen. Bradley Johnson asks, will I ever run out of flannel, or is the mountain just infinite? First of all, I do not store my flannel on a mountain. I store it inside a volcano because my flannel is always on fire. And secondly, no, I'm never gonna run out of flannel. Chucho points out, in relation to Great Comet, that in 2004, Avenue Q was the revolutionary or experimental or groundbreaking option and not Wicked, which sure was grandiose and legendary, but was pretty standard, big, flashy musical. I agree, and this is why it's not the best argument and it's hard to draw these lines through, like, is it the safer bet that's winning Best Musical or the more experimental thing? More so, with this being in 2004, I think it marks, when I become a musical theater historian in my aging years and my hair turns fully gray, I think Avenue Q and the Wicked discussion might be one of the starting points of this trend. Somewhere around there in the late 90s, early 2000s is where maybe this seems to start, but I don't know. I don't know if this is actually a real thing or if it's just something that I'm inventing. Luke asks if anyone knows why Sunday in the Park with George withdrew itself from Tony's consideration. The reason they gave, which seems pretty valid, is they had a limited, hard-locked run. They could only run for a certain number of dates, and to be Tony's eligible, you have to allocate a certain number of free tickets to Tony voters, and they crunched the numbers, and that just wasn't going to pay off. They weren't going to be able to fill enough seats to make enough money to make the show worth it. That's at least the reason they gave. I also suspect that because they're a limited run, especially with someone like Jake Gyllenhaal, who maybe doesn't have too many musical theater aspirations, the marketing benefit of winning a Tony doesn't really pay off for them. They will be closed by the time that sort of publicity boost will do them any good. And so I think it seemed like a very strategic choice. It is, it's sad to me because it means it's not going to be documented in the same way that some of these other shows are. Book Maven 404, in with a correction, thank you. I was asleep in theater history, not actually exaggeration. Chekhov's gun, or at least the concept I described, actually comes from French playwright Eugene Scribe, originator of the well-made play, who said if you show a gun in Act 1, you must fire it in Act 3. I wonder how that became Chekhov's gun. Be a question for a theater history professor. I wonder if there are any out there. David asks, shouldn't Tonys have an apostrophe in it? Good question, common misconception. No apostrophe, T-O-N-Y-S, no apostrophe. The reason for that is this award show is nicknamed after Antoinette Perry, who, among other things, co-founded the American Theater Wing. Her nickname was Tony, and the award was nicknamed after her. So this award show is a combination of several of these awards, a collective of these awards, Tonys, plural. no apostrophe. If it were her giving out the award or she created these awards, that might be an argument for Tony's apostrophe S possessive, but that's not what it is. Also on that topic, because I have to look it up every year, it looks like this year Twitter world is going with hashtag Tony Awards 2017. No the, add the year at the end, because it's confusing. Who knows what it would be. But I'm sure if you tweet any other semblance of combination, people will see it, because, you know, we're all about performing to the endless void out there. Sonia asks if I will be live tweeting during the Tonys. Absolutely! Tune in at Musical Mash on Twitter. If you follow me on Facebook, those come from my Twitter, but Twitter is really the best way to, you know, see the stupid jokes I attempt to make during the telecast. And Bradley Johnson is back saying, honestly, I wish all these performers would win a Tony. Everyone on this is amazing. I agree. Cue Oprah footage of you get a Tony, and you get a Tony, and you get a Tony. It's always one of the things I struggle so much with this. I love the Tony Awards because it is honoring this art form I love so much. I also love this art form so much because at its core, it's non-competitive. Theater just, you know, there can be as many shows or as few shows, and any kind of competition that's introduced is at its core artificial. And I always, you know, as much as we like talking about who's going to win and who's going to lose and who got snubbed and who deserved that, I just love that this exists and that it's time for us to talk about these things and talk about art and musical theater and what makes it great and what are the things that make us like it so much. And so, regardless of who wins and who loses this Sunday, let's celebrate that. How wonderful theater is. I'll see you on Sunday. Happy Tonys!